I'm Charlotte Koo. I'm from the University of Illinois College of Law. I'm also past chair of ACUNS, so very happy to be moderating this very interesting plenary on governing the global commons, new norms, challenges, and pathways forward. The subject and the presentations would have been interesting in their own right, but I must say are even made more relevant in light of Bob Orr's keynote address and Christer Jansson's Holmes lecture yesterday, both of whom have pointed to conditions that are pushing the boundaries of our existing systems, structures, and mechanisms for governance. And indeed, the very mechanisms for governance that were created to solve problems some years ago, some decades ago, we see inadequate to address problems of today, or have even become themselves obstacles to problem solving. So to help us probe some of these issues further, we have an excellent panel of individuals who combine academic work with practice at the international, regional, and national levels. These are both thinkers and doers who will give us the benefits of their experience. They will speak in the order listed in the program. Each will take about 15 minutes, and we will leave then some time for discussion and questions. So if I can, without further ado, invite Nico Schrijver, who is, of course, the award winner of his volume of sustainable development that we heard announced on a couple of days ago. He's also the chair of public international law at Leiden University and a past chair of ACUNS as well.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. My presentation builds on Chapter 4, on management of the global commons, of the book Development Without Destruction, which indeed, as you kindly mentioned, won the award. You see Vincent van Gogh, the flower painting, and I'm also so happy to be able to tell my wife that I got a prize for it, because for many years this book project was known in our family as Destruction Without Development. So now at last it's all back. And perhaps you know that there was a very famous article some decades ago about the tragedy of the commons. That we, human population, do not care much about our climate, our ozone layer, about our seas and oceans. But I will distance myself from that very pessimistic finding, and I will discuss a couple of issues to illustrate that, in fact, the global commons regimes, of course very incomplete and very fragmented, can also be seen to serve as laboratories for new principles and rules of international law and new forms of global governance. And within the 50 minutes to go, I fly you to the moon, but I also take you to the subsoil of the deep seabed, and we will explore the climate system, all in a very brief way, of course. And being the director of the Grotius Center for International Legal Studies at Leiden University, of course I have to relate it to the work of my compatriot Hugo Grotius, who came forward at the beginning of the 17th century with the notion of common goods, in Latin res communes, in the sense that they belong to everyone, and yet they are from no one. And as a matter of definition, I use the concept of global commons to denote natural resources that are beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, of states. And they belong to the international community as a whole. And we have related concepts, which for reasons of time I will not discuss, but common pool resources, global public goods, concept widely used in the United Nations system are also very pertinent concepts to our discussion today. And just to say a few words about Grotius, let it be a source of inspiration for the young researchers that at the age of 19 he published already his first book on the law of price that was commissioned by the Dutch East India Company, so we are talking about the colonial days, and there was quite some rivalry between the Portuguese, the English and the Dutch. At a certain moment there was a clash at the taking of a Portuguese vessel, Santa Catarina, in what we now call the Straits of Singapore, and the Dutch took it, and of course it happened to be loaded with china, with silver, with spices, with a value of 3 times the gross domestic product of the Netherlands at that time. And Grotius, as a very smart young lawyer, was hired by the Dutch East India Company to defend, which was of course indefensible. But he said, well, they try to monopolize the navigation to Asia, they try to monopolize fisheries, they try to monopolize certain parts of the seas and oceans for international trade. We cannot accept it because this is a global common. This is a res communis. This should belong to everybody. And it was a very smart memorial. And one particular chapter he published in 1609 on the freedom of the high seas, the Mare Liberum, and that became one of his most famous books, together with his 1625 first edition on the law of war and the law of peace, which our chair will agree is still the main categorization in international law. Now, to stay a little bit on the seas and the oceans, and to jump from the 17th to the 20th century, we have of course the fantastic achievement after 9 years of negotiations that the United Nations adopted in 1982 the Comprehensive Law of the Sea Convention. The president of the Law of the Sea Conference also aptly called it the World Constitution for the Oceans, and indeed it regulates all uses of the seas and the oceans, overflight, fisheries, conducting of marine scientific research, navigation, including to straits, to transit straits like the Straits of Singapore, and it establishes these various maritime zones. But indeed, the latter became somewhat of a tragedy for the global ACUNS, for the res communis. It's maybe a somewhat complicated graphic, but on the right side we are on land, and we see that an internal lake or a river or a canal are all under the sovereignty of the coastal states. Then we have the territorial sea. During the days of Grotius, 3 nautical miles only, but now expanded to 12 nautical miles. Then we have an adjacent exclusive economic zone in which the state does not have full sovereignty, but exclusive economic rights to fish and also to mine the continental shelf. And only after the exclusive economic zone we are at the high seas. And then in basically 95% of the seas where commercial fishing takes place has been taken, has been nationalized, so to say. And then we are on the high seas, and we have what is called in UN terms the area, the deep seabed, and that has been declared your property, because it is the so-called common heritage of humankind, where we can find manganese nodules, where we can find beautiful sand and stones and but for the moment not yet subject to exploitation. And from a global commons point of view, very interesting that here the deep seabed regime served as a kind of laboratory to detail the regime for a global common. And it became an example for some other regimes. And I briefly mention here 5 implications that states, although they are capable of mining the area, visiting the area, can never appropriate it. There has to be established an international regime, well, that is now the International Seabed Authority. There has to be sharing of benefits, especially also with the landlocked countries. Well, I'm not thinking about Switzerland, but the landlocked developing countries and geographically disadvantaged states. It has to be reserved for peaceful purposes, so you cannot use the deep seabed area for the stockpiling of weapons of mass destruction. There is a demilitarization of the deep seabed. And think about the grandchildren and future generations to come. So these are 5 essential implications of the deep seabed regime. Of course, we are also talking about fish stocks, although most of the fisheries takes place within the exclusive economic zone. But tuna, for example, we have the very interesting regimes for whales. We have some other fantastic and charismatic marine mammals, including dolphins. And there is still the Grotian regime of freedom of access, formally, but qualified by the concept of the maximum sustainable yields, which came already forward in the 50s in the UN Convention on the High Seas, adopted in the late 50s. There is of course a lot of regulation nowadays, many fisheries agreements, and that functions all quite well. And to a certain extent, that is also a global commons regime, since it is not subject to national economic jurisdiction. Whaling is, of course, a fantastic chapter of the law of the sea, dating back to the League of Nations, to the 1946 International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, which established a supervisory body, the International Whaling Commission. Rather unique, once again a laboratory, that they established a moratorium, a ban on whaling, with some opting out, objecting out possibilities. Japan and Norway, and to a limited extent also Canada, have objected out, sometimes for the sake of protecting the rights of their indigenous peoples. But in the case of Japan, to conduct marine scientific research, well, as a lawyer I'm not very much of an empirical data study man, but nobody can explain to me why you need 10,000 species of whales each year for just conducting scientific research. So basically it is for domestic consumption. Interesting is also that comprehensive law of the sea convention is applicable to the whales as well. Now I fly you to the moon, which is very much modeled, the moon regime, upon the law of the sea convention. And it all started with the Outer Space Treaty, declaring outer space to be the province of mankind in 1967, followed up more or less at the end of the Law of the Sea Conference by the Moon Agreement, which establishes also the common heritage of humankind regime for the moon and other celestial bodies. But we have to say that so far it got only 13 ratifications, as opposed to the Law of the Sea Convention, which has 165. But once again, these 5 major international implications of non-appropriation, of an international regime, which did not yet materialize, sharing of benefits, reservation for peaceful purposes, and taking into account the interests of future generations. Then I take you back to the Earth, and then we have two very different polar regions. And the first one, the oldest known in international politics, is Antarctica. That is a huge landmass, basically a continent in itself, surrounded by the seas, whereas the Arctic region, the North Polar region, is basically an area of sea, to which the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is applicable, but surrounded by the land of 8 coastal states. Now, as regards Antarctica, we have a lot of regulatory instruments, with also quite some innovative features. You all know that there are still territorial claims to Antarctica, but they have been frozen. And literally, and also in a more symbolic way, in the sense that the consultative parties have agreed not to assert their territorial claims. So it's a very unique way of international dispute settlement, to freeze the conflict, to freeze the territorial claims, and to have a rather advanced regime for scientific cooperation, for international cooperation in general. And then we have quite a number of specific legal instruments for the protection of Antarctic seals, for the regulation of fisheries. For a moment, based upon an initiative from New Zealand, one was also dreaming about exploiting the coal, the oil, the gas on Antarctica, the so-called BB Treaty. But then there was an outcry of public protest, one of the early examples also of the impact of international civil society. So that got cracked, although it was adopted, the BB Convention, but it became, in fact, it never entered into force, and basically it was replaced by an environmental protocol adopted in Madrid. Now, on the Arctic, I can be rather brief, because there are hardly regulatory instruments so far. It is still very much a matter of the 8 neighboring states, with the European Union as an observer, with some other states, but a lot still needs to be done. And of course, these two regions have in common that they are extremely important for the vital ecological functions of our planet, for the climate, for the ozone layer, etc. I quickly move to the last global common under review, the air mass, the ozone layer, the climate system, 3 very interesting special regimes, each with their own features. Probably the most successful one is the ozone layer regime, an early example of a so-called framework treaty. So here once again, a laboratory for new forms of international cooperation. And then very specific protocols, Montreal Protocol, but amended many times, and very successful in banning the use, the production, the trade in certain helio gases, which would have destructed our ozone layer much more than nowadays is the case. Basically, it is a promising example of positive international cooperation. We cannot say the same about the global climate regime. Once again, a framework convention adopted in 1992, the Kyoto Protocol, as you know, but could enter into force only in 2005, with the United States never coming on board. And now we are involved in very complicated discussions on a post-Kyoto regime, which is very much necessary, which should be a universal regime, but that is a very challenging task, as we will also hear next week at the Rio +20 summit. Some people say Rio -20. To conclude, There's not much left, of course, of the Gronchian heritage, because many areas became under national jurisdiction. But I still like the concept of the Mare Liberum, now in the form of the global commons. We have many different global commons regimes. I mentioned only a few. These are very fragmented regimes, but in general, we went from the Gronchian freedom of access to very regulated use and protection. And in any case, in no area of the world is any longer applicable the rule first come, first served. And what kind of innovations do we see? Principles, common heritage of humankind, but for the climate, for biological diversity, the common concern of humankind's notion, precautionary approach, sustainable use of natural resources, especially sustainable use of marine resources, all relatively new principles emanating from these global common regimes. We have a rather elaborated deep seabed mining regime. We have the freezing of the claims on Antarctica as an example of innovative international dispute settlement. The ban on whaling, which is quite effective in general terms. In the ozone layer regime, very interesting cooperation with industry, with penalties on the production, on trade, on use of ozone depleting mechanisms, and also very interesting special features in the climate regime, which I cannot detail now, but joint implementation, clean development mechanism, tradable emission rights, and that the climate regime is really a front runner, is serving as a laboratory for the testing of new principles and new regulatory forms of global governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nico. Next we have Ioannis Vrailas, who is the Deputy Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, who will reflect a bit on his experience working with the UN. Thank you. And time, I dare say, is one of the global public goods right now that we are somewhat in scarce supply of, so I would plead with my panelist colleagues to do the best they can with our limited resource at the moment, please.
Thank you very much. I had a nightmare sometime between the end of February and beginning of March. I rarely do, but that one was really bizarre. I was walking by a pond when I got attacked by a couple of geese who started biting my legs. So the dream itself had a happy ending because I sort of, after the first element of shock, I reacted very bravely and I kicked the geese, and they had to withdraw in hasty retreat. Unfortunately, what was happening in real life was that I was kicking my wife in bed, who was rudely woken up, and it got even worse a few seconds later, because when I was asked if I had not completely lost my senses, the best line I could come up with was, "I'm sorry, I thought you were a goose." And it's a tribute to to the 19-year-old marriage that this has been the most serious crisis we have faced, and I feel relaxed talking to you about it. And I felt relaxed sharing that story with the ambassadors of permanent representatives of Cameroon, of Algeria, of Argentina, and my colleagues from the US, Russia, and the UK. The scene setter was that I was trying to lighten things up. We were in the midst of 10-hour-long negotiations on the following issue. The Secretary General of the United Nations is quite keen to change the management culture in the UN Secretariat. Had created what he called a change management team. They worked really hard and they came up with about 62 recommendations, from little things to more important things that would change that culture. Wanting to be transparent, he shared that with the General Assembly. unfortunately, the G77, Russia and China said, no, we have to decide whether you can, whether you can proceed with these things. On our side, we're saying, well, you know, as head of the bureaucratic unit, basically, you should be able to feel free to take the measures that he feels appropriate. Some of the measures, for instance, just to give you an idea, is that when you travel by plane less than 6 hours, you should be flying economy rather than business, which is, by the way, what we do with the delegation of the European Union, actually even beyond the 6 hours. Or another measure was to encourage the use of video conferences rather than, again, the travel, which can be quite costly. It took us about 18 hours between a Friday afternoon and the whole of Monday not to reach an agreement, in spite of my good story and my attempts to cheer everybody up. It all went to a vote, which we lost because the G77 and Russia and China had the numbers. Other recent incidents of frustration at the UN. Following the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, we made an effort, and it was after long months of several months of negotiations, it was more or less recognized. We have achieved now, as European Union, an enhanced observer status, which allows us to speak not as the rest of the other observers at the end of the list of speakers, but among regional groups at the very beginning of the debate. I spent most of the month of October and the whole month of November arguing both with our member states, but also with many countries from the developing world, whether the whole point was, should we speak among major groups, as the General Assembly resolution clearly says, or last among major groups, which was the somewhat unilateral interpretation of the developing countries, based on the principle that the United Nations is an organization of sovereign member states and not regional organizations. In practice, that meant, should we be speaking second or fourth, because now, or first or third, not all regional groups take the floor. But we basically lost the regular session of the General Assembly dealing with this very important problem, rather than with the substance of the issues that were being discussed. I think the term frustration would be very kind when we think of the UN's reaction to what's happening in Syria. Although there are some serious talks ongoing to see how we can bring the Annan plan back on track. And of course, the frustration borders on the disappointment. Nico referred to it when I think of the negotiations that have led to, or still ongoing, to the Rio conference. We on the EU, we spent a lot of time in introspection, trying to define our positions, but we did come, I think, with ambitious goals and targets, both on the green economy as a creator of jobs, as a catalyst for sustainable development, and also on the governance of the governance structures of sustainable development. Now, it's not always easy to drum up enthusiasm on a leap year on these issues, and the G77 did. For those of you who have seen the film Jerry Maguire and remember the Cuba Downing character, the line was "Show me the money," which was to the tune of $100 billion. So nothing can happen if they do not get that amount. See, discussions are not going particularly well as we speak. I'm not particularly hopeful that we will go beyond a declaration of good intentions. I haven't come here to turn you into John Bolton. So I would, if I ever met him, I would very respectfully, but equally very strongly disagree with him, because we tend to take what the United Nations stand for and what it has achieved for granted. Its universality, its legitimacy, its global network, the presence on the field as a provider of global public goods, the achievements in the field of human rights, tangible advances worldwide, in the sense also that even where violations take place now, there will be reactions and consequences. It would have been impossible a few years ago for the League of Arab States to suspend one of its members and to table a resolution on the situation of human rights in that country. If those of you who remember the Organization of African Unity, compare today with the African Union and its actions in the Côte d'Ivoire, in Somalia, in the Sudan, and in other places. We have the Human Rights Council taking important decisions on Libya, on Syria, and for the various dictators around the world, those who commit mass atrocities. The ICC could possibly be the best option for them, actually, in the light of the fate suffered by others. The United Nations, as Nico has also said, has steered the normative course, and also through its global summits and its covenants, and its convening power is also unparalleled. Proof of it is that all the world leaders regularly come here, at the very least during the so-called ministerial week in the General Assembly. Important things to keep in mind, again, what the United Nations stand for. Now, comparing, however, where we stand today to where we stood in the 90s, when I also served here, and there were hopes then that the New World Order and the United Nations would be able to do much more. Of course, now we are faced with some serious difficulties. It's the magnitude of the problem. It is the fact that the problems are of transnational nature. The cliché is they cross the borders, that nobody asks for their passport. It is also a fact that even when we do have the rules and the regulations, it's not always easy, and sometimes even the concept of peer review, which could be helpful, we have difficulty in having it accepted by several members of the organization. Even then, the supervisory mechanisms are of a national nature, and states increasingly seem unable to cope with the threats and the challenges. And that is also true of the international organizations and of the United Nations. Their mechanisms are not real suited to effectively tackle the changes that have occurred at a very dizzying space, and the newly defined power relations between states and emerging actors such as the civil societies, between those two and the private and the business sector. Thinking of the UN, the main bodies, the Security Council. I represent the EU. I challenge any other organization to come and tell me that their members have achieved a larger degree of like-mindedness and integration. I cannot talk to you about the Security Council because our members disagree on this one, and therefore there's no common position. Imagine what's happening at 193. General Assembly, I referred to some incidents earlier, not playing exactly, or not always playing a very influential role, and that is, of course, even more true of ECOSOC. And the Secretariat, I don't want to do injustice to the many people who work day and night, especially those on the field. I met Ian Martin a few weeks ago. He almost lost his life recently in trying to help the Libyan authorities ensure a smooth transition in their country. Yesterday I met some young people who are trying to do good in the eastern provinces of the Congo. But in the UN Secretariat there is a stall mentality and sometimes a very cautious approach to change, to put it mildly, that doesn't serve the organization very well. There's also the problem of the ideological divide that sort of poisons every debate, even in areas where we should normally be agreeing. The most prominent example being, for instance, the responsibility to protect concept. It has now been entirely identified with the use of force in Libya. We all forget that the responsibility to protect has 3 pillars, and the measures of enforcement, which, by the way, are not limited exclusively to the use of force. You can have sanctions or other measures. That's just one of the pillars. The other being, of course, the responsibility of a country to protect its citizens, and the responsibility of the international community to assist the country to develop its capabilities in this field. The world financial difficulties are catching up with us, and so the budgetary issues have become very prominent. Fifth Committee experts are all over the place, blocking agreements, even on issues that should normally are not of their immediate domain. And so we are faced with a situation that prevents, in what would be a very nice dream, the UN from being an open, a representative, an effective organization that would base itself on the best possible articulation of legitimacy, of expertise and of leadership, and ensure both the coordination of policy and its implementation in coherent manner. What can we do? Well, I think we all have. We can all try the best we can to steer things in a better direction. The developed countries, I think, need to make a better effort to listen to the concerns and the worries of the developing ones, who see themselves increasingly facing the consequences of decisions that for which they cannot influence, either because they are taken by small groups, G20, and they question their legitimacy, or sometimes even by the private sector or other actors. We really need to sit down, listen to them. This is what, as the EU, if I can blow my own trumpet, we're trying to do. We're actively pursuing partnerships with the small island states, with the small states, with the least developed countries, with various groupings to try and identify areas where we can work together. And we have our agenda for change in the field of development, where we do remain the main actor and the main contributor in the world. Our agenda for change is now tailored to the needs of each individual country rather than a one-size-fits-all format. The emerging countries, granted, they would like to have more of a say, but rights come also with responsibilities. And there are political responsibilities. We sense sometimes a selective approach to, or selective sensitivities to human rights. There are financial responsibilities, a much larger contribution to the UN budget, and there's also a more important contribution that they could play in the development agenda. The developing countries need to do a better job to convince everyone that inclusiveness and representativeness go hand in hand with effectiveness and functionality. As again, some of the examples I mentioned earlier have proved, this is not always unfortunately the case. There's also a question whether the current groupings, the G77 and the NAM, the non-aligned movement, are representative of the needs and positions of all of its members. We on the EU, we sometimes find it difficult to find an interlocutor on the other side, because those groups are sort of, the feeling we have is that they're taken a little hostage by the more radical among its members. And it's always difficult if you cannot sit around the table and discuss at length the various issues. And the United Nations as a whole should focus on what it does best. It's convening power, it's a meeting place for all mankind. You may say it's a talk shop, but still it's a very important one that would have to be created if it did not exist. It can continue to be active and also even improve its performance by coordinating a little better in the field of crisis management. They have a vast array of means, from early warning and mediation all the way to post-conflict peace building. Since I mentioned peace building, the Peace Building Commission could also be, its works and its impact could be vastly strengthened. To avoid duplication with other international entities, the UN can try to achieve a better coordination or develop better coordination mechanisms. And when this is possible and desirable, it can also lend support and legitimacy to the decisions taken by those entities. The UN can coordinate the action of regional organizations. This is actually happening a lot, whether in concrete cases like Syria, or more in general on thematic issues such as conflict prevention. There was a retreat hosted by the Secretary General last Saturday on the issue. It can mobilize the other actors, civil society, NGOs, private sector, the public in general. It has been said that the civil society are the best allies of the United Nations. Think of the Beijing agenda, the women's rights, how this has been pushed forward by the feminist movements around the world, how important that is. The United Nations can have the comparative advantage when it comes to sustainable development. One problem of sustainable development has been that it has, usually the economic pillar has been too much highlighted at the expense of the other two, the environmental and the social. I'm pessimistic about Rio.
If I can ask you
I really have half a second.
Thank you.
I'm pessimistic about Rio, but hopefully it won't be the end of the road, and we can come up with some governance structure, including what they refer to as an ECOSOC plus, that will allow this more coherent approach. This is where we stand. Think again of the United Nations, the good it does. The European Union is committed to effective multilateralism with the organization at its core. If we could implement, even in part, what the Charter and its lofty goals and principles call for, the world would be a lot better for it. Thank you very much.
Next we have Jeffrey French from the One Earth Future, who also brings to his current work experience in China. So.
Well, unfortunately, I can't begin with any reference to any of my previous dreams because I tend not to remember them. But what I can do is open by just expressing OEF and my own sincere gratitude for being placed on such a fantastic panel, to have two esteemed diplomats, along with two previous John Holmes Memorial Lecture speakers. It's quite the opportunity, and hopefully it's an indication of the kind of future value add that OEF will offer this field. For today's presentation, I'm going to continue this kind of process of introducing everybody to One Earth Future. I know we're something of a new player in this field, by first talking about where we came from and how that led us to some of these core governance concepts that inform our doing from our think tank side, and then apply those same concepts to the global commons field. In 2008, OEF really got its start with an exploratory conference, which was comprised of an interesting group of people with an impressive range of backgrounds and kind of depth of experience, including Tom Weiss. We also were started with an interesting mission. During that exploratory conference, we were trying to figure out how to create global peace in 100 years, with a particular emphasis on trying to figure out how to engage business as stakeholders. So we considered a range of different peace-building projects in particular, everything from conflict mineral governance in Latin America to special economic zones for peace in Central Asia. And what we really kind of came to recognize through all of this was that governance was this kind of meta-structure that was woven through everything, and that rather than focus on any particular singular issue ourselves, we needed to be operating at this meta level if we were going to create a world beyond war over the next century. So from there we went into really getting our think tank started, and there we worked in areas of governance with a particular emphasis on governance trends. Many of those governance trends we've discussed over the last 3 days. Everything from the blurred boundary between public and private actors to the UN agenda, increasingly including multiple stakeholders. We've developed our thought through multiple forums and modes, with particular engagement with various academic communities. Our first white paper actually ended up launching a series of workshops at Oxford University that only culminated just 2 weeks ago, and that really was around this kind of concept of what roles can NGOs play in conflict governance. As we focused on that from our think tank side, we've taken those lessons and then also kind of engaging with those lessons in terms of our implementation side, our do tank. Oceans Beyond Piracy, which many of you heard about during lunch yesterday, is an effort to pull multiple stakeholders together to create a long-term sustainable solution to maritime piracy. We also have a few new, more recent field projects that are only just now getting launched. One is emphasizing livelihood creation in Somalia, which is a clear kind of carry-on to Oceans Beyond Piracy as we look to give people a reason not to become pirates in Somalia. And we're also looking at ways to engage the business community in the responsibility to protect movement. When it comes to OEF's work in the Global Commons, we were never explicitly intended to be engaging with the topic of today's plenary. Our focus, as I said, has always been on this long-term peace building. However, even our first project, Oceans Beyond Piracy, we're already engaging with issues of the Global Commons, high seas security when it comes to maritime piracy. And then obviously, commons issues often act as drivers of violence. OEF has a sister foundation that's been around a little longer than us named Secure World, which is, its main mandate is trying to prevent the weaponization of outer space. One of the core concepts then that are underpinning all of these various missions and projects is the idea of issue-specific legitimate authorities. And again, this kind of came out of our think tank side through a series of papers and a series of engagements with the extant literature and academics, and then also with various other practitioners already out in the field. What we mean by issue-specific legitimate authorities are new governance institutions that kind of disaggregate the old international regime model down to specific issues. This, again, is a theme that we've been hearing a lot throughout the last few days. Mr. Johnson's lecture yesterday, he talked about the functionally differentiated aspects of governance and how that's the new trend. Increasingly, political space is being defined by, not by territory, but by social concern. In terms of issue-specific authority, we also really emphasize these as true governors of those particular issue areas that are capable of not only making decisions, but enforcing them and acquiring compliance. But then critically for us as a peace-building organization, when we talk about them as authorities, we mean that they are legitimate authorities. That's the most crucial component because they aren't necessarily relying on violence or even other forms of coercion to get people to comply with their decisions. More typically, this will be achieved through an interaction with the actual stakeholders or in the Global Commons arena with the actual appropriators themselves. We often will see this comprised as networks of state and non-state actors. To get into some of the examples of what we've seen and where we kind of are inspired by, the first and foremost one would be the International Committee of the Red Cross, which obviously was started and began with a mandate in international law, and its mandate is to protect civilians and combatants in times of war through a series of international treaties known as the Geneva Conventions. In the sports world, two of the more massive issue-specific authorities would actually be FIFA and the International Olympic Committee. Even though frequently, even nation states, sovereign regimes will have their own complaints with FIFA, FIFA clearly is the power over soccer or football throughout the world. After the last World Cup, a number of countries, including Nigeria, wanted to start interfering with their own domestic football bodies, but FIFA, using the various powers that it has, such as prohibiting them from participating in the next African Cup, was able to get the Nigerian government to actually back away from interfering with how football is governed, even within its own territory. In literature and in a lot of the conversations that we've already had, there are many other words or terms for these types of governors. Public-private partnerships was something we heard about yesterday. International regime literature has been around for quite some time. For One Earth Future, though, the most precise way of thinking about these actors are what their issue is and whether or not they are actually the authority within that given issue. When there is a lack of such an entity within the governance structure, that can actually highlight a gap in a potential place where OEF might be able to get involved. And that was actually how we were kind of led, as John explained yesterday, into the piracy arena. For piracy, as it's operating on the high seas, for piracy, the principal concern is security on the high seas. And we see this vividly, but the biggest issue for piracy is that it's currently governed underneath the structure of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we heard about from Nico. And as Nico highlighted, ACUNS is all about trying to regulate all of the various issues on the high seas, whether it's deep sea mining or security on the top of the oceans to economic exclusion zones. And so what this does is by aggregating all of the various issues in high seas governance under one international regime, it makes it very unwieldy and difficult to respond to new challenges that the international regime over the global commons encounter. And so as piracy has become an increasingly new hot topic, first in the early 2000s in the Straits of Malacca, and then again now off the Horn of Africa, one of the principal issues facing stakeholders is that they're not able to reopen UCLOS without reopening all the other questions, particularly when it comes to things like deep sea governance, deep sea mining, these sorts of issues. A lot of countries don't want to reopen those questions, and so therefore they don't want to even approach UCLOS and modify it for the needed changes that are needed in piracy. The result of this is that what we have now is a system where states and private actors are doing ad hoc changes to the system as they see fit and as they see necessary, but nobody's actually coordinating these sorts of issues. States are operating off of these mandates. The EU has a mandate that they just have expanded to be able to include actually doing land operations in Somali territory itself. Shipping industry is actually turning to private military security companies more and more, which itself is an entirely unregulated aspect of high seas governance. So the Oceans Beyond Piracy solution then is to focus more on supporting new anti-piracy frameworks, such as the UN Contact Group on Piracy off the coast of Somalia, while also coordinating with some of these non-state actors, such as associations that are trying to regulate private military security companies. Until that is achieved, basically what we're doing is that we're largely gap filling until we have that new regime. So kind of thinking about how these issue-specific legitimate authorities would operate in the global commons and what implications it has is that rather than attempting to manage an entire group of issues under a single massive catch-all international regime like UNCLOS, we already are and will likely continue to see this move towards issue-specific networks via either issue-specific treaties and or multi-stakeholder organizations like the Forest Stewardship Council, also covered yesterday by Professor Johnson. Another example in the global commons might be the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, an entity that's crucial to the functioning of the Internet. Notably, neither of those entities rely upon any sort of course of force in the terms that we typically associate with nation states. So just in terms of wrapping up, one of the things that I guess from the OAF perspective that I would like to offer everyone is just kind of suggestions in terms of where we can go for the global commons, particularly because we're likely to see this continuing evolution of governance mechanisms away from multilateral and towards multi-stakeholder. For the UN, this means that to be effective, agencies need to bring non-state actors in earlier to their planning rather than later. It should be something that you're thinking about earlier, and obviously a lot of organizations are already quite effective at doing this. One of the fantastic things that we've encountered as we've begun our entry into the Somalia field is the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs does a fantastic job at actually pushing information out to non-state actors, particularly through their financial tracking services website. It enables organizations like One Earth Future to actually look at an issue area, identify where money is going, consider where money needs to actually go in addition to that, and then try to fill those gaps. And I think, just in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So next we have Barend, who is a member of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and presently at the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, Klingendaal. Please.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much for willing to listen to what I'm going to tell you here. I'll try to be as short as possible. I was just thinking that when I, as a professional diplomat, from time to time had to brief my Prime Minister and then had a maximum of 2 minutes, so I could compromise what I'm going to say in 2 minutes, but I'm not going to do it because I think it's too interesting to not take a little bit more of some time. Let me start with making a kind of disclaimer. I will speak about UNESCO. I was for 4 years Dutch ambassador to UNESCO. I will be quite critical about UNESCO, but first of all I'd like to say, to prevent any misunderstanding, that I very well recognize that UNESCO is doing a lot of very good jobs in the fields of bioethics, oceanography, statistics and others. The point, however, I like to make is that when you compare the goals that UNESCO has in its constitution, and etc., and in its work plans, when you compare that with what they're actually accomplishing, it's a very, very large gap. And the question is why? What I'm going to say is that I believe there are at least 5 conditions for success for international organization that are not met by UNESCO, except for the field of culture, and have been met by NATO during the Cold War. And the comparison with NATO is just to make clear what I wanted to say about UNESCO. It's not about NATO, I'm going to speak, it's about UNESCO, but it might help to compare with other organizations, and I will also compare UNESCO, as you will notice, with a few other organizations. Now, go back first, a clear goal. I think that's the most important thing. You have to know what you're going to do, what you want to do. Now, NATO was quite clear what it wanted to accomplish. It wanted to make a political and military front against the threat of the Soviet Union. That was it. And therefore, the NATO constitution is quite clear. The parties will maintain a military force. They will consult together whenever necessary, and they will consider an armed attack against one as an armed attack against everyone. It was quite clear. Now, UNESCO has a very beautiful constitution, but I will only quote here the first article. There are many different goals mentioned in there. And I will just limit myself here to the first article. The purpose of the organization is to contribute to peace and security, which is already very wide, by promoting collaboration in the 4 fields I mentioned here. Communication is the fourth part. By collaboration in these fields to further universal respect for justice, for the rule of law, and for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Now we're mentioning here a lot of things, human rights, peace, security, which of course are all very commendable, but it's quite a lot. And besides that, it's in a sense contradictory to what usually is expected from UNESCO to be the organization to deal with education, science, culture and communication. As a result, the mission statement of UNESCO is also quite wide. This is the official mission statement. It contributes UNESCO to the building of peace, elevation of poverty, sustainable development and intercultural dialogue through education, sciences, culture, communication and information. Again, it's quite a lot. Building of peace, poverty, sustainable development. Now compare this with the mission statements of WHO, the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization, which I have mentioned it, but basically WHO is about health. That's it. Food and Agriculture Organization is about food security. That's it. Now it would be much easier if UNESCO was just about education or about education and science. But if you also include poverty and peace, it makes it much wider. Now, as a result of this very wide mission statement, the program of work of UNESCO is also very long and wide. And this is just a few quotes from the presentation of the Director General of UNESCO on the work program for the years 2012-2013. And you just see how many different subjects are mentioned. Gender equality, science, of course, biodiversity, culture and development, freedom of media, culture of peace, education for all, cultural diversity, sustainable development, climate change, AIDS, human rights, and that's not only for Africa, which is a primary subject, also for the least developed countries, for the poor segments of every society, for indigenous peoples, for post-conflict situations, small islands, middle-income countries, South-South, youth. Almost everybody is included here, and almost every subject is included here. All really very recommendable, very good, but it's impossible to do. I go back now to the we come to speak about the division of labor in a moment. I'll just go here. To make clear how impossible it is to do, is to compare the Secretariat with Secretariat of the Atomic Energy Agency, which has a very limited mandate, but has more people, more staff members, and has a larger regular budget. And they're only dealing with nuclear energy. And they do it, in my view, quite well. But they have one subject to deal with, and they have more money and more people to do this. UNESCO has a very wide program with less people and less money. Now, let me see, I go back to the, yes, division of labor and the necessary means. Sorry, I have to go back to this one. Here, the division of labor. You might have not noticed that there's a very important distinction between those two constitutions. In Nederland's constitution, it's the parties, the member states, who have to do it. It's very clear. The parties will maintain forces, etc. In UNESCO, it speaks about the organization doing something. And now, the problem is, it's not very clear who is the organization. There are basically two interpretations. One is the organization, that is us together, all the member states who want to do something. And the other interpretation is it's the Secretariat. Now, the interpretation that is being used recently is it's the Secretariat who has to do everything. But it's impossible. So the division of labor in UNESCO is just malfunctioning. Be giving the job to a Secretariat who is clearly not able to do all this. Involvement of member states is crucial. If you want to accomplish what in my view is the most important goal of UNESCO at the present time, education for all, to make sure that everybody in the world gets good education, not only the youth but also adults all over the world, which is crucial to deal with a lot of important issues. If you want to deal with that, it's the member states who have to do it. It's not the Secretariat who can do it. That means that you have to involve member states. Now, at NATO, again, because we felt, as member states of NATO, that we had to do it, we sat together every week, sometimes several times a week, in a political committee in the council, to discuss what the state of affairs was and what we had to do. So, we had permanent representatives, we still have them, at Brussels, NATO, and we met every week. Now, we also have, almost every country, more than 100 countries, have a permanent delegation to UNESCO. But how often do they meet? Once every 2 years. And even then, there's no discussion. It's a long list of statements of ministers, and there's no really discussion, because we leave all the work to the Secretariat. Now, the last point, almost last point, is if you want member states to fulfill their obligations, you have to find a way to nudge them to do that. Because every government has a certain tendency to do only those things that they like to do and to forget about other things. Now, one way to help countries to fulfill their obligations is to publish what they are doing, to discuss what they are doing, and to name and shame those countries that are not fulfilling their obligations. Now, that's what we did. Certainly did. It's changed a little bit now for the last 10 years. In NATO, of course, every country was sovereign and decided themselves how much they wanted to spend on defense, but there was agreement that they had to do a good job. So every country, once every 2 years, I think, presented their military plans, defense plans, and they were discussed among the other delegations. It was in a very diplomatic fashion. We were not very unkind, but nevertheless, they had to face the other delegation to tell what they were doing. I think it's a very important part of getting countries to implement what they have been saying they should do. Now, again, in UNESCO, we're not doing it. We are saying that we want to do so, and then nobody asks us whether we have done so. Now, if we take it really serious, when we would really take serious our obligation to give a good education to our people, for instance, we should, in my view at least, sit together and discuss how we're doing. Now, there's one exception where UNESCO is doing a better job than in the other fields. That's culture. And that's also why often UNESCO is portrayed as the culture organization of the United Nations. I don't like it because, in my view, education and science are at least as important to deal with the current big issues in the world as culture. But they are forgotten about because UNESCO is doing such a relatively bad job in these fields, except again for some specific fields like oceanography. Why is it doing a good job in culture? That is precisely because the conditions for good work are fulfilled there. There are clear rules, because there are a number of treaties that are quite clear about what member states should do. And when member states do not fulfill their obligations, there are also ways to, not to force them, but to help them, let's say, to think about implementing. Give one example, the World Heritage Convention. 2 years ago, Germany was decided to build a bridge near Dresden, World Heritage site in Germany. And because of that, because this bridge was limiting the value, the universal value of Dresden, Dresden was put off the World Heritage list. It was only the second time in history that the place was put off the list. So that's a kind of way of telling countries, you have to really fulfill the obligations, or if not, we can take common measures. So I come to my conclusion. In my view, education, science, culture and communication are of crucial importance. I spoke about education. Without a well-educated population, we cannot deal in a sustainable manner with the world. The same is true for science. We need the best possible science to deal with worldwide issues. So if UNESCO would like to play a role there, and I think they should play a role there because it's the only worldwide organization with such a wide legitimacy to deal with it, they should be turned around. That's really a big change of the organization, in an organization that has ambitious but clear and realistic goals, where member states accept their responsibility for fulfilling these goals, not leaving it to the Secretariat who cannot do it, where cooperation between member states is therefore at the heart of the organization, where member states stimulate each other to implement agreements, for instance by name and shame if necessary, in a very diplomatic manner, you can do that, and provides the Secretariat with the necessary means to fulfill its tasks. But again, in my view, the role of the Secretariat is not to fulfill the goals of UNESCO, but to help member states fulfill those goals. Thank you very much.
We did begin this panel 25 minutes late. On the other hand, I don't want to start a cascading effect throughout the afternoon. So, okay, Alistair's given me a sort of a 10-minute signal, I think. So that, in my view, suggests possibly 2 questions. So if there are those in the audience who would like to pose a question, I would invite you to quickly move to the microphone and do so. Well, apparently we seem to have participatory democracy here, and it appears that lunch is a hand, all right.
From India. I have a question with Mr. Haar. Actually, I want to ask you, I'm confused on one thing. I want to ask you that why did you compare the UNESCO with NATO? Because NATO is a regional organization and UNESCO is a part of UN. It's an international organization. So, can you clarify that? Why did you compare the structure of UNESCO with the NATO?
Yeah, sure. No, okay, thank you very much. Well, very good question. The reason, very quickly answer is, I work for both organizations. And when I came to UNESCO, being used to working at the EU and working at NATO, I was astonished by the differences in way of working. And I would start thinking about why is UNESCO not fulfilling its purposes and did NATO do it? And I tried to put some of the reasons, to list some of the reasons that are not specific for the specific circumstances of NATO. Of course, NATO is a very different organization, but I think there are a few things that are of general global relevance, like you have to know what you want to accomplish. If you don't have a clear goal, you cannot accomplish the goal. And if you have a goal, you have to make sure that you provide the necessary means for fulfilling this goal. So that's why I made this comparison. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next question, please. Perhaps you could pull the microphone down. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Anne Richter, and I'm actually also working with UNESCO, by the Secretariat, so I'm on the other side. And I was wondering if you can bring up the slide with all those priorities, if that would be possible, on your presentation that you had. You see, you came up with a slide with the different priorities. And in the meantime, I wanted just to add something. For the Education for All report, for example, that is a program that is run for a long time, but it is funded basically by US voluntary budgetary funding, and what I have understood is there are really the conditions were actually negotiated. So if there's a peer review or not, that is part of the negotiation how it is actually run. So it is not considered as a part of the core program of UNESCO, but it is an extra program that is run funded by basically by US contributions. And concerning your ideas about, or your comparison about the General Conference and NATO, I think NATO has much less member states, so it's very easy to come up with quicker and more regular meetings, as all the General Conferences every 2 years, where you basically bring up 192, 93, 94 member states. Also, UNESCO has, until now, maybe it's changing now, but because of the budget situation, but we have paid basically the flights for people coming from developing countries. So that was per diems, that was an issue. And to have 58 members in the executive board every 2 years, twice a year, they were pretty busy with, I agree on that, with all those different topics. But the General Conference, as you know, I mean, the head of states are talking, or the ministers talking during 3 days, giving the statements, and all this work for done is done in commissions, and financial commission, and the law commission, and the program commission, so they are busy all the time. So I think it is, I mean, I do understand when you do comparison, but you want to make your points, but I think it's a little bit too easy to say, right? And for Africa, I mean, I was working in the Africa department myself. That is a unit directly linked or under the umbrella of the cabinet of the Director General. I was at that time, I don't know when you were ambassador, but I was at the time with the ADG was Nurini Tijani Sapos, that was a leading guy. All the programs, AIDS, climate change, human rights, whatever, are streamlined under these priorities, right? In the program and budget, I agree at a certain time that was very much flu, but now, twice, and in the last 2 times, they really came up with acts of priorities acts with benchmarks. So I think they really try to change the management culture, and that is something I think goes aligned with all the other UN agencies. So I mean, I do understand your point, but there's a lot of changes also going on, so I think it would be...
Thank you. I think we got the gist here. So if you want to give a kind of...
Well, maybe I can answer the 3 points. First of all, forget about the comparison. I mean, that's not... I agree, they're very different organizations. What I want to say is about UNESCO, and maybe 2 things in reaction to you. One is on the question whether you can have more, get more together. Sure, 193 countries together is not that easy, but they are almost always there anyway. And what I find really astonishing is that you have permanent delegations, people who are full-time representing their countries in Paris to UNESCO, who never meet. And why not? We are sitting there and doing very little, so why not meet when the meeting rooms are there? Why not have real discussions? And it's possible, if you think it's important enough. The General Assembly basically meets around a year, and there's no practical reason why member states of UNESCO could not meet every month, even with 190 countries. And of course you need special rules to have a real discussion, but now at the General Conference there's no real discussion because you have these member states, all the ministers speaking for 5 minutes without discussion. What's even worse is that at the General Conference, I agree there's, and that's the second point, there's a lot of discussion in the committees, but again that's about what the Secretariat is going to do. And that's not the real issue. I'm not interested in what the Secretariat is going to do in education because with $300 million a year they cannot do that much. I'm interested in what the member states is going to do. And that is the big, well, if you want, 180 degrees change that I would suggest is necessary. It's not that I deny the importance of, let's say, climate change, but what I want to say is that the Secretariat is not able to do anything recognizable of any recognizable importance about climate change. They will have a booklet, they will have a meeting, but that's the member states again, with all the stakeholders, who have to do it. So as long as member states are not agreeing among themselves that we want, for instance, education for sustainable development, which I think is a very useful thing. If the member states are themselves convinced that they have to do something about it, it will not work. And that's the big problem now. We leave it to the Secretariat to come up with a nice booklet about sustainable development. But that's not going to help. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists for this discussion. As you probably all know by now, each of our panelists will receive as a thank you from ACUNS a copy of Global Governance, the newsletter, as well as a membership. So with that, let me just thank you and the audience for taking part, and don't hold it too long.